Welcome back from the coffee break. There is a thought behind the program. The transatlantic issues come first, as they should, where we have the big country, or the two big countries. I mean, what we see now is the United States and Russia forming a group of two with seemingly similar interests. I hope not, but this is what it looks like right now. Now we are digging deeper into Europe. And what the program says is we could either be strong and have cohesion, or we could be weak and be fragmented. I guess the truth, the present truth, is a bit of both. But we are not in normal times, and we will have in our speeches adjustment to that. What can be done in this particular situation? What does it look like now? What may it look like if we follow the advice that we have received from the speakers of the first panel? There is a division among the speakers. Barbara Kunz, who is the head of the Europe program at SIPRI. She is French and she is German. I don't know how the division is. You can say that yourself.
50-50.
Sorry, you started off with German at least. Yeah. She has a background from a number of universities and institutions, the IFSH in Hamburg, the IFRI in Paris. She's been in the United States and she's been in many other places. And she will start with the NATO side of the European issue. She will be followed by Adrian Hyde-Price, who is Professor Emeritus from Gothenburg, with an English-British background. He's now still at Sydow, which is called in Gothenburg, but he has a previous relations as professor and a senior fellow at universities of Leicester, Birmingham, Chatham House, and surely more. And you have also been working in Stockholm. And you have a Swedish wife. That shows that you have known the intricacies of the Swedish scene as well. Finally, Göran, sorry, I didn't speak very much about you. You will, Adrian, you will bring up the countries. Many say that the countries are the dominating ones, and Ann-Sophie brought up the possibility of alliances of various kinds, and which I think is a quite good idea, and I think that what we see in Paris is a bit of that. Adrian will speak about the countries. What will they mean? Can they divide? Will they be divisive, or will they be in the direction of cohesion? I don't know, but you will know now. Göran von Sydow, finally, director of SIEPS, the Swedish Institute for European Policy in Stockholm. You have a background in Florence, and you have a background in Sciences Po, and you have been working extensively on these issues. I'm extremely pleased to have the three of you here, because you will together form a comprehensive picture of Europe and our possibilities as I see it. So please, Barbara, could you start?
Thank you so much, Gunilla, and of course, thank you for the invitation to speak here. Now, I think like many of us here, I had prepared something to say, and then things happened in real life, and I decided to change what I say and so on, and so I now again decided to depart a little bit from the assignment I was given. But if you just go back a few days, I mean, the way we used to think about European security is that we had NATO in charge of collective defense, and then the EU is an important body sort of helping with that, mostly on the defense industrial side, and also, I mean, sanctions against Russia, things like that. All of this used to be handled in the European Union. And what we all, I think, more or less could agree on, and in the European debate, is that strengthening the European pillar of NATO is what we need to do, which mostly runs through national capitals and national defense spending, but I will not talk about this. Now, this idea of strengthening the European pillar of NATO is the European consensus after years of discussing European strategic autonomy, which has already been mentioned here, and which is a debate, if you will. If you look at the European defense debate of the past 10, 15 years, you could actually reframe that entire debate as a debate about the likely future trajectory of the transatlantic link and disagreeing European capitals when it comes to the predictions of where this link was headed. If you look at the French side in this, and I mean, President Macron was the self-proclaimed champion of European strategic autonomy, and this debate was very much pushed by the French. I think there are actually quite a bit of misunderstandings here in Europe, because usually the side that did not want European strategic autonomy framed it as if it were about decoupling European security from the United States. I would argue that that is actually not true, and that the starting point in the, at least Macron version of European strategic autonomy, was the analysis that US, I quote Macron here from his 2017 Sorbonne speech, that we would see the gradual and unavoidable disengagement of the United States from European security. And so that the idea was that Europe had to start thinking about a plan B, because it could no longer rely on US security guarantees, at least in the medium to long term. Now, others did really not like this vision, and there was a vivid debate, sometimes pretty toxic. The countries on the eastern flank, for example, really did not buy into this Macron vision. They also had empirical arguments saying that, well, it is simply not true that we are seeing a disengagement of the United States from Europe, even during the first Trump administration. For example, the experience seen from Warsaw was just very different, where in the end of the Trump 1 administration, you had more American troops on Polish soil than you had at the beginning. So this debate lingered on, and I think it is still relevant in the current context, because if you take the debate about European strategic autonomy as a debate about does Europe need a plan B, we are exactly back at where we were about 10, 15 years ago. And following the first panel, I would also say that we actually do know what to do, and now that we likely have some sort of answer to this question, namely, yes, President Trump himself essentially telling us, yes, you do need a plan B. There is a list of things that we as Europeans need to do. And I mean, many of them have already been mentioned during the first panel and also during the speech in the beginning by Veronica van Danielsson. And to just go through a list again and maybe add a few things that have not been mentioned yet, I would start by the obvious, which is, of course, work together in this. Do not try to run to Washington individually by trying to impress President Trump with a percentage of your GDP spent on defense, but try to really work together, and also try and compensate for the various blind spots that all European capitals have in trying to understand European security, and sort of try to make the sum more than try to be more than just the sum of all the individual approaches. So, and primarily avoid beauty contests, avoid getting to 5%, avoid going to buy F-35s now just to please the Americans, because what we really need is to fill the capability gaps in Europe that we have together, and to sort of really come together here. But that has obviously been said because it's so obvious to do that. I think another aspect that is really crucial and that we do not talk enough about is that we need to learn or relearn to actually read the world, and without having the Americans explain it to us, which means we need to start with each other. I think most European countries have very blind spot when it comes to certain other European countries. Could give you my assessment of what I think Swedish blind spots are if you're interested during the Q&A. And I think it is also very obvious that we are really terrible at reading the United States. The fact that this is such a big surprise now also tells us that we simply haven't done our homework, or that we probably fell into the trap of only listening to those Americans who said what we wanted to hear, and never listened to the others. I think another aspect to really keep in mind is that the Russian regime said it multiple times. For them, this is not just about Ukraine. To them, this is about the European security order, this is about the European security architecture, and really the broader schemes of European security, which also means that for Europe right now, the debate is not only about peace troops in Ukraine or how we can ensure that a potential ceasefire is respected, but this is really, in a way, the real deal, with the Americans potentially throwing us under the bus. And so learning to read that and to act appropriately is also something that needs to be very high on the agenda. Final point where we also need to learn simply and to become better at analyzing things is what is usually called the deterrence IQ. I think one aspect that to me is actually the most worrisome in what comes out of the United States right now is that President Trump is also talking about arms control deals with Putin, and this has a lot of implications for Europe, depending on what comes out of it. I mean, if there is a reduction of nuclear weapons everywhere, fine, maybe that's even good news, but since Trump gave Putin everything he wants prior to negotiations on Ukraine, we simply don't know what a deal between the United States and Russia might look also in the field of arms control, or, I mean, general sort of the big picture strategic stability dimension. And quite frankly, I think in Europe, we're not even good at analyzing this. Like, we don't even know our positions, and we might not have positions in this because this is a bilateral Washington Moscow affair, first of all. But we need to watch this very, very carefully, and this is obviously part of the question that this is way beyond. I mean, I don't want to minimize Ukraine, of course, but sort of just to say that the scope of the problem goes way beyond the question of a ceasefire in Ukraine. A final word on, again, I mean, the term of European strategic autonomy is toxic, so I'm not going to use it, but I mean, this idea of strengthening Europe is also something that I think should be irrespective of the current crisis, because becoming stronger as Europe does not preclude at all to come back to transatlantic cooperation one day, or to hopefully have a functioning NATO in the future. It would just be a better basis and a more level playing field for Europeans to talk to Americans about European security, because quite frankly, why would being dependent even be a desirable position? And I'll end on that.
Thank you very much. I think I will leave my questions to you for a while, and we go on with Adrian now.
Good, thank you, Gunilla. I feel something of slightly out of place here, in that I'm an academic, not a policy maker or someone from the think tank community. And we academics, we don't run on Trump time. We tend to reflect. We tend to reflect on the world and think of the broader patterns, and we can take months to formulate ideas and theories, and then, you know, we write, and then we wait a year or so before our publication comes out. And you can, but what I would say is, I think after this strategic earthquake that we've just gone through in Munich and are still feeling the aftershocks of, I think from the academic point of view, we have to recognize that most of our theories have proven inadequate. The theories that we've developed over, 20 or 30 years since the end of the Cold War about how globalization was eroding geopolitics and great power conflict was a thing of the past, and ideas of Wandel durch Handel, the idea of economic interdependence, would create trust and cooperation, and social constructivist ideas about the diffusion of liberal norms and values through the international system. These theories and ideas that academics have developed for decades are really proving pretty useless now. But I think there are some older and more unpalatable truths that we can turn to, and I would perhaps point to Thucydides, who wrote in his history the Peloponnesian Wars. He wrote, "The strong do what they will, what they want. The weak do what they must." I think sadly we're back in that world. More recent than Thucydides is Kenneth Waltz, who wrote about states conducting their foreign policies and their interactions in the looming shadow of war. He wrote that in 1979. Since, the end of the Cold War, no one's taken that seriously, but that's where we are. We're operating in the looming shadow of war. After the Munich conference and now the talks in Riyadh, clearly there's considerable panic and unease across Europe. And what is very clear, and what should have been clear to us from at least, 2011, when Robert Gates came and gave a valedictory tour of Europe, and he spoke about the need for Europeans to take responsibility for their own security and defense. And he said, you have to do this because, America's not always going to be there for you. That was in 2011, I think it was. And it's Europeans, I think, after perhaps Munich, are really waking up to the recognition we have to do more. But what I would suggest is that rather than looking to the main institutions in Europe, the key institutional pillars in Europe, the European Union and NATO, they are extremely valuable and worthy, but we should also look to build on what has already emerged in Europe and what has been developing, I think, in really quite important and significant ways. And that is what we academics would call, I suppose, plurilateral cooperation or minilateralism. The multiplicity of forms of cooperation, often between like-minded states, that have been developing in Europe over at least the last 10, if not 20 years. And it's been suggested they've created an archipelago of cooperation in Europe. And there are many forms of this, and I think I'm echoing what a number of my colleagues have already said. I think everything's been said, really, but I'm still going to say it. That there are forms of bilateral and multilateral, plurilateral cooperation that have developed that we need to build on and develop. Some of these are more political frameworks, the Visegrad 4 or the Bucharest 9, or the Nordic-Baltic 8. But some involved forms of military cooperation of greater or lesser significance. I'm thinking of Nordefco. Nordefco is now, I think, this is Nordefco's moment. This is where we have the opportunity to really build much deeper cooperation in the Nordic area between like-minded countries. There's also the, maritime cooperation, the Swedish-Finnish Naval Task Force. There's the Belgian-Dutch cooperation. There's different forms of cooperation between air forces, the Heavy Air Wing and the European Air Transport Command. We need to build on these sorts of initiatives. The most important thing we need in Europe is to deepen cooperation between the major powers, and I mean Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. Because without these three countries, the chances of Europe defending itself and providing for its own security, taking responsibility for its own security, they're limited. I think here we've seen some signs of progress. I mean, in a way, I have some optimism in these dark times, and we've seen there's the existing Franco-German cooperation that could be a bit more reinvigorated. There's also the UK-French Lancaster House Agreement of 2010. Again, that needs another injection of sort of love and development. But more recently, we've seen in October last year the Trinity House agreements between the UK and Germany. And they're about industrial cooperation, but also naval cooperation, and also cooperation in the framework of the forward land forces in the Baltic states. So I think there are some important developments here that show perhaps the European three are beginning to deepen their ties, and that's, I think, a strength at the heart of Europe. The biggest cleavage, or I think sore that Europe faces, is basically the consequences of Brexit. And I think we have here again an opportunity to move beyond the Brexit. Frankly, I think it was a fiasco, but there we go. We move beyond Brexit and develop new forms of cooperation between the UK and the EU. You have in the UK, for the first time, a Labour government, Sir Keir Starmer, that is committed to a reset of relations with Europe and wishes to develop closer relations with the EU, both in terms of trade, but I think significantly important in terms of security and defence cooperation. And that treaty is being, and maybe it'll just be a declaration, but it's being discussed and debated at the moment. And I hope that we will perhaps move beyond the sort of debates over Brexit, and we move beyond illusions of European strategic autonomy and find new ways for the EU and the UK to cooperate. There's also forms of defence cooperation that have emerged that, again, actually are in the news now. The Joint Expeditionary Force. The Joint Expeditionary Force is a UK-led defence cooperation initiative. British generals often like to talk about it as a club for the beer-drinking nations of the North, but it brings together the UK, the Balts, the Nordic countries, and the Netherlands. And certainly in the UK press at the moment, there is much discussion of the possibilities that the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, might be deployed to Ukraine in the future. The Joint Expeditionary Force has a 2-star headquarters. That's basically to command sort of division-size forces. So, and it's been exercising closely together. It's not enough on its own, but perhaps that's I think, is the form of a sort of coalition of the willing that is in my view, one of the important aspects of the future of Europe. We have to build our cooperation from the ground up through, I don't know, coalitions of the willing, plurilateral fora. The final thing I'd just say as I end is that, again, there's been an awful lot of depression generally and sort of worries about the future. I think we should be concerned, but we need also to focus on what we can do and the cooperation that already exists. We need to build upon so that we knit together these islands of cooperation in Europe into something more coherent. And I also think, just to end with 2 quotes, and I want to I'll start with an Italian Marxist philosopher, Antonio Gramsci, just because I want to show I'm a good European and not a little Englander. Antonio Gramsci said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And that's perhaps what we need now. We need to think of, recognize it's bad, but let's be optimistic and see what we can achieve. The final quote is, and I'm British, so I have to end with a quote from Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, in the darkest days of the Second World War, when Britain was standing alone, he would receive these reports, a memorandum from its defence chiefs and others who were, talking about how terrible the situation was, and he would write at the top, KBO. KBO. And this is the Churchillian version of the old British saying in the Second World War, keep calm and carry on. Because KBO, for Churchill, KBO means keep buggering on. And that is, I think, basically what we need to be doing in these difficult and extremely challenging times. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Great. And now we come to the European Union challenge. Yep.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for the kind invitation and to what has been a very interesting discussion this afternoon. Now, before I turn to the European Union, I just wanted to add a brief comment which relates to reactions in the Munich Security Conference. And Adrian, he is very humble to say that IR scholars have been wrong about everything. But I would also suggest that this reaction, the very strong reaction of many, maybe it says that some of the security policy analysts, they should have cared more about what other political scientists and analysts have been studying, namely the ideology behind the new Trump administration, which is not a new phenomenon, but it's the phenomenon that we know in ideological terms as populism, a contested concept, but gradually more and more a common understanding among political scientists that it's a thin ideology. It reflects a little bit what Constanze said earlier, that is based on the idea of a society divided between two distinct groups, the people, the real people, that have a general will, a volonté générale in terms of Rousseau, and then the elite. And the problem of modern democracies is that this general will, the real people's will, is distorted on its way to policy outcomes by those elites and intermediaries that kind of meddle with it. That's the press, that's the judiciary, that's the opposition, that's all of these forces. And this is essentially how I read the Vance, but it's an outcome of that ideology. Maybe it's a faux pas to go to a security conference and talk about ideology, but that's what it is. And then the second element is that the MAGA government, they want to create links to like-minded. That essentially holds this idea of how the world operates and what should be then the order that they perceive as good. And that is what is the threat. And it relates, of course, to security issues. So that was just a side remark that sometimes also pay attention to what people outside of the standard field of security policy are doing in order to understand the deeper fundamental changes. Now, I was asked to say something about the EU in this relation. And of course, over the 3 years since the Russian full-scale invasion, I would say, and it has been mentioned, that the complementarity between NATO as an organization and the EU have been working in relatively good terms. And that is also based on the understanding that these two organizations, they are different in character, whereas NATO is a relatively static organization with a limited task. That is, of course, now challenged when the one dominant actor is withdrawing its full support to the functioning, the political content on that. EU, on the other hand, it's a process. European integration, that's how I understand it. This is a process that has distinct institutions that can be filled and that normally advances through crisis, where actors come together, initiatives are taken, be it at the supranational level or from the member states' perspective, such as, for instance, initiatives relating to strategic autonomy. And in this context, I would say that in the area of defense, I mean, everyone understands that this is not the prime task of the European Union, but it has this broader repertoire that can be used and filled within the European Union. So if you look at, for instance, defense industry, if you look at hybrid or space, research, infrastructure, and also limited though, but access to budget. These are things in which there is a gradual, it's not fast over one night, but a gradual change of what the European Union is. Now, of course, defense is always sensitive because it's high politics, and this is where member states normally would hold back any attempts to move too fast forward. And it's also true, as Barbara presented, there have been different, let's say, if not conceptions fundamentally, but of course between the autonomist camp and the transatlanticist camp. And I would say that what's happening right now is, in particularly in the transatlanticist camp, a bit of a reflection about where do we go? How much do we do this together? Now, this means that expectations of what the EU and Europe can do, as we all have been saying, it's on the rise. Expectations of the need to move forward fast. However, as any observer of the European Union, particularly in the field of foreign and common security policy, would say, there is always the risk of a expectations-capabilities gap. High expectations of what the EU could potentially do, or Europe as such, but with quite limited capabilities, be it on the budget side, be it decision-making, or treaty-wise even. So there is always a limit. Second element of a constraining factor is, of course, also the fragmentation. Now, the fragmentation takes place within member states. This is the longer term, of course. That relates more to domestic politics than anything else. But it's the fragmentation of our party systems, and we will witness that on Sunday in the German elections too. What fragmentation means is, of course, that the established parties, they are losing ground. It makes it much more complex to form coalitions, to form governments, and therefore it is a constraining factor for leadership at the domestic level. We saw the same tendency in the European Parliament election, also producing a more fragmented legislature at the EU level. And this is a constraint that one needs to do and deal with. Second element of fragmentation is, of course, that between the member states. Now, how does one then cope with fragmentation? I would say there is one, at least, attempt by many to say, well, centralization can solve this problem. We can see that in the decision-making system of the European Union, that more sensitive issues are pushed up to the leaders, to the European Council level. You see that in the new European Commission, it's a centralization of political resources to the head of the Commission, who wants to lead again then a geopolitical commission. You could also see that in terms of centralization in assembling more capacities at the European level. However, there is always a potential that there is resistance towards any of those attempts to centralize. So I would not be a political scientist if I did not come up with a 2x2 table in this situation, right? So I have two dimensions that I think are relevant to understand where Europe and European Union is moving forward. And the first question is, of course, the traditional one. Is this the moment for a deepening of cooperation within the EU? Yes or no? It's not a binary choice, I understand, but for the 2x2, you need to have that, right? The second dimension is, of course, is this done in unity or not? Yes or no, a binary choice. If the answer to both of those questions would be yes, the outcome would be then, so we have a deepening of European integration and it's done in full unity. Then we're moving to, you can call it strategic autonomy or something else, but at least a strengthening of a state-like capacity within the European Union, in particular in the area of defense. If the answer would be no to the unity, so we deepen, we don't do it in unity, then of course there are options of enhanced cooperation, of avant-garde, ad hoc solutions, increasing the flexibility, perhaps also allowing for non-EU members to opt into certain fields. Of course, there's the risk that it becomes, the positive side, action can be done, you can actually move forward. The negative side is that, of course, it also displayed a disunity of where Europe is heading, and it might be that some of the member states you would like to have on board in such a more bolder steps would not have the political capacity. On the other hand, the willing are not held back by those who now more openly are flirting with Putin's Russia. Now, this would be the deepening side. If then the answer is no, we're not deepening, but we do this in unity, I try to find a label to what happens then. And in my understanding, and I can challenge in this, that would mean the stagnation or irrelevance of Europe. And if the answer would be no to both of those questions, we do not deepen cooperation, and we are disunit, then it's the collapse or the subordination of smaller European states. I'll stop there. Thank you.
It was a cliffhanger, wasn't it? A real cliffhanger. I'll challenge you on the answer later. But I'll open the floor now, and Lars-Erik, then Mikael.
If you look at the organograms of the new structures in Brussels, in the Commission and the External Action Service, you see a power distribution with a dominant number of people from Northern Europe, Germany, Lithuania, Estonia, and even a political director from Sweden, Olof Skog, on the one hand. Then you see the head of the External Service from a former associate of Borrell, a Spaniard, Belén Carbonell, and you see a new Director General for Middle East and North Africa, who's Stefano Sannino, the former Italian head of the External Action Service. So I'm coming back to a question we had in Sweden when we joined. The deal between the North and the South. Because in order to engage Italy and Spain and the others, I suppose, you need to offer something to them. Their threat perceptions, their lack of resilience in France and other countries. Where is this deal? Who could negotiate this deal in order to get an overall enhanced European security?
And who are you addressing? All three?
I think both, I would say Barbara and Göran. Probably Barbara, with her background from France, has thought about this quite a lot. We've had this discussion from the Academy when we made a visit to Paris some years back, where we heard from the military, top military brass in France, that their main concern at that point was internal and to the south, not to the east.
Yeah, we'll take only this question first. It's plenty of work for you anyway. So Barbara first.
Well, let me start with France. And I think the one thing that cannot be overstated enough is that a lot of things have changed in France since 2022. Some things not related directly to the war in Ukraine, because the entire French strategy in the Sahel failed, and this is it with Operation Barkhane, and all of this is history. But I think that's not the main reason. I think what really, really, truly happened is an evolution of the threat perception in France when it comes to Russia, on how to read European security dynamics. And if you just look at what France is doing, you can clearly see, I mean, French officials themselves talk about a pivot to the eastern flank. So I think in the French context, thinking that France is still only mostly concerned about the south, that is wrong. I think a second aspect to keep in mind about France is also that one of the messages France is trying to get across at the European level is that the South is not only about the South, but the South is very much about Russia as well. Russian malign action in the Sahel and other parts of Africa, disinformation. So, I mean, this distinction between the East and the South, I think, in many ways is also not accurate anymore. Now, I'm less of an expert on Spain and Italy and so on, but I think these countries also always bought into the idea of NATO solidarity and a 360 degrees approach. So and this is what all of NATO is built upon in the end, right? Is that we don't just look into our own backyard. So what I would say there is that what actually is important to understand for all the Europeans, and especially if we now enter into many more debates about how we can do more, is to understand that it's not the East or the South, but that we really need to look at both. And although, sort of in the past, there used to be much more emphasis on the South at the expense of the East, but that it would be a mistake to make sort of the same step in reverse now and completely disregard the South until things explode there, quite frankly, with a terrorist threat that it's not gone at all. And also, Russia, and also using forced migration as a weapon against Europe. So, this would really sort of be my hope, at least, is that if we look at things now, that we can take a holistic take and sort of leave all these old debates behind us, sort of East versus South, but also this old EU or NATO debate. No, it's just one big problem we need to solve and see what instrument is best suited for what.
Göran?
Yes, well, thank you. Very good question. And I will expand on one point that I promised to give to my introductory speech, but I'll come back to that. Yeah. That's a question of enlargement. But just to begin with, I think, it went pretty quickly, precisely the period of the full-scale Russian invasion was also the drafting of the so-called strategic compass and the Versailles Declaration that President Macron is, of course, very fond of and reiterates already now in the Paris meeting the other day. And during that process, you can see in the drafting process how that, it tilted also the attention towards realizing the threat from Russia. So already then, at the time, many member states who were perhaps not preoccupied as much with the Eastern, they gradually came to understand that this is the case. Now, second element to this argument to say that my point is really that many of the member states, if not to the same extent, but they are very concerned with the current situation. Of course, there are degrees. So if you look at Eurobarometer, which is not perhaps the perfect source to everything, if you look at the question they ask the populations, what is your perception of Russia as a threat to the security of the European Union? You would find a striking 3/3 would say, yes, you understand this as a threat. And there's a variation. In a country like Sweden, it's 97% who agree that this is a threat. In Cyprus, it's only down to 60%. But it shows also that countries like France, Italy, Spain, they will be somewhere around the mean value. So it's understood as a threat. Even when the second question is asked, do you perceive Russia as a threat to your country? We get the similar figures and the similar pattern. So my point is, I think this is widely now understood. But the third point I wanted to mention, and Gunilla asked me to say something, it's of course this important question of EU enlargement, which is now, of course, discussed also in terms of how that can be increased in the pace and the speed as a guarantee for Ukraine. And this, France has made a big shift when it comes to the policy of enlargement after the full-scale Russian invasion. But just to say that this is, of course, politically not an unsensitive question in many member states. And this will, now the geopolitical paradigm stresses the urgency. Von der Leyen seems to implying some kind of fast track for Ukraine, given the current situation, where there is out sort of clearly that the US would not accept Ukraine as a NATO member. But that fast track, it still would need to be carried through with lots of decisions on behalf of the member states. And remember that in France, it's even in the constitution said that this will be held by a referendum. Politicizing these issues, we've seen that historically also in recent history in Europe. I mean, remember that in the Netherlands, after Crimea, there was a referendum about the association agreement with Ukraine, and it was a majority against. Just to say that this has to be carried very carefully, these processes, and not to overplay the promise to Ukraine, if I can put it that way. It's quite important.
Thank you. Adrian, do you have any comments on this as well?
No, simply to perhaps add that, I mean, if you look at the literature on the academic literature on plurilateral or minilateral cooperation, I mean, one of the downsides, one of the negative features is that it can tend to create, these fragmented islands and prevent the sort of broader east-west, north-south understandings across Europe that are essential. So I think there is some risks in the sort of plurilateral, minilateral approach.
Yeah. Did you want to come back on
I just wanted to say that, of course, if you look at you asked really about the Commission's organization, and I can also see that there is a division of certain interest that follows from geography. So Southern Europe more interested in the economic and social affairs and green affairs. So you have to remember that sometimes the European Union operates as a very long-term game with many, many negotiations ongoing, and that makes part of a major package deal. So my point is, if Northern Eastern Europe insist on certain strong elements in relation to Russian security and defense, you might want to be a little bit more generous to offering also the kind of political, concessions of various sorts to other parts of Europe. So just as a general way of solving your question a bit.
Thank you. Mikael, you're next on the list.
Göran, you have already answered my question, which was, of course, about enlargement and how you would add to your figure. I mean, could it be a three-dimensional matrix, perhaps, with the enlargement being the third, if unanimity and well, whatever. So think about making it a three-dimension thing. it's so important. Thank you for what you said. I had in mind to ask also Adrian and Barbara about what you said about fragmentation as a risk. And you, Adrian, said that maybe given the difficulties we are dealing with, going for smaller units, Jeff, whatever, Nordefco, would be a solution. Don't you see, but this is a question to you, do you see a risk of credibility of deterrence as difficulties to find the unanimous full NATO approaches, instead focusing on something which is simpler to make decisions on, efficiency versus legitimacy, eroding credibility of deterrence or not? So I'll leave it with a question like that. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that building cooperation in particular groups of countries is perhaps what at the moment it's certainly the easiest thing, but I think it also contributes to Article 3 of the NATO treaty, which talks about individual countries having responsibility to provide necessary defence forces, and that's also where resilience comes in. And it is perhaps easier to start building this sort of stronger national capabilities and regional capabilities from the ground up through things like, Nordefco or the NB8 framework, or in a trilateral framework in terms of total defence between Finland, Sweden and Norway, than it is trying to do this at a sort of NATO level or a wider European level. I think there are risks, but I also think there's at the moment some great gains to be made. And if countries, particularly those in the north and east of of Europe, can strengthen their own capabilities by, in part, sharing costs and creating economies of scale, it seems to me that's a win. So I think there are risks, but I think the benefits are also there to take.
Yeah, I think the question was also to you, Barbara.
Yeah, well, maybe to approach it from a different angle. Effective deterrence, we don't decide what that is, right? We want to deter Moscow, so Moscow, in the end, decides what they think is effective deterrence. I think there's several aspects to this, and it's sort of not how much we tried. It's not even what percentage of the GDP we put in our defenses, right? In the end, it's what are we able to do militarily? Can we really send or convey the message to Moscow that if you try this, the price will be too high to doing this? Now, you can get to that point at a unilateral level. You can get to that point collectively, probably much easier than if it's only 2 or 3 smaller countries who try this. Because, I was said earlier, even here in Sweden, they like to call them the great powers, but even the great powers, the so-called ones like France and Germany, the UK, even Poland, nobody has the means to do that by themselves. So I think it has to be holistic and it has to be a functioning military entity in the end. How you get there, to me personally, doesn't matter. I don't even care if it's NATO or in the strengthened European pillar or the EU or Jeff or whatever. What matters in the end is to get there. That's especially true on the conventional side. On the nuclear side, there too, I'm not even sure that it is fair to say that, for example, the French deterrent is too small, because again, deterrence is about being able to hold targets at risks that your adversary values. How you get to that assessment matters more than how many warheads you have. And whether you sort of, in a credible way, again, manage to convey that message. Because again, whether our deterrence works, it's decided in Putin's head, not in headquarters in Brussels. And so on the sort of cooperation and fragmentation, yes, there is a risk on fragmentation. It is especially risky if we do so much fragmentation that things don't add up to a European defense. That's the main risk I see right now, where also all these regional formats are sort of very much inward-looking and really clearly lacking sort of a I don't mean pan-European in the sense of incorporating Russia, right? But sort of a European vision that encompasses all of NATO, Europe, and perhaps Austria and Switzerland if they want to. But that it's all like very small, very, very regional focused, and especially very much judged against our input, whereas what matters would be the output.
Göran?
Well, just to say, not to go against, but for the sake of debate against towards Adrian, I mean, the kind of flexibility, of course, if it's quick action one is looking for, but I think there is also a point, particularly in these times we're living in, that, the institutions that we hold, that safeguard certain things about how we decide, even the possibility of transparency, old school values, right? Accountability, and also that there is a question of scale. So I think, again, not to say that the European Union will develop very fast into something distinctly different, there is a set of institutions and ways in dealing with these matters that can actually, for instance, on the procurement side or industrial side, that can be to the advantage in order to avoid the fragmentation and the overlapping structures. Because, again, it's about finding the posture of dealing with the threat that we are up against.
Next on the list is Björn Herolf, then it's Mikael Holmström, then Marianne Lanatza.
Thank you very much. I'd like to, Adrian, he cited Herodotus in his beginning remarks. He was one of the first to try to analyze a war from a more scientifically point of view. And that's very interesting because he came out with a conclusion. And I try to translate it into English now. How the war goes is not possible to foresee. Because of small things, great things can come out, and emotions cause unforeseeable effects. That's very interesting, because of small things, very big things can come out. And we haven't seen what comes out of this Ukrainian war yet. My question is this: how to form stable long-term political governmental decision-making in a democratic society? Because we have a problem with a democratic society, and the problem is that the voters are not foreseeable. They decide from many different points of view, and we have seen that in many European elections during the last years. We have had trouble with Hungary, we have had trouble with Poland, which is now coming on what most people think is the right side. We have had trouble in France, we have trouble in Netherlands, and it was also pointed out here that there is trouble in Germany. So we don't know for sure how the voting populations in different European countries will come out when they see what's going on. So you were right, Göran, when you pointed out that even if there is a broad public opinion that the Ukrainian war in Russia is a danger, how will they vote? And how do we form stable democratic governments in Europe to form a coalition of the willing? That is my question.
Yeah, seems like a question for everyone. I'll put Mikael Holmström's question beside yours too.
Yes, there was a catchword in the other panel that we need to think about the worst cases. And someone also said that we should wait for Trump, Europe must act. And Adrian mentioned the coalition of the willing. But let's think about the worst cases then. How would Europe react if Trump and Putin gets along and makes a deal over the heads of Ukraine, and that both Ukraine and most of the European nations find totally acceptable? That's my first question. How should Europe prevent that to happen, to prevent this such a deal between these two leaders to become a reality on the ground? How should Europe and Ukraine prevent this? And my second question is about being active and coalition of the willing. Shall we wait for the next move for Trump on Greenland? Or is it possible that EU puts up a naval peacekeeping force of naval ships that patrol the Danish territory waters around Greenland? Thank you.
Yeah, We have to put the two together for time reasons, so please try to make a division between the two so we can carry on.
Should I go?
Yeah, you can start.
Yes, so I think I would like to address the first question about how to deal with the voters, essentially. I mean, this is the problem of democracy, right? You have to handle them. But I think in conjunction with what I said before about the populist zeitgeist or whatever, you know, the challenge to representative democracy as it works, I mean, the effects of such movements are more clearly seen in those countries where you have more majoritarian electoral systems. That's where these kind of powers, they can get to their own majority. And this is what we're witnessing in the US. We've seen slightly perhaps part of that in Britain or in Hungary. Whereas in our other systems where we have proportional elections, that's a dispersion of power, right? So we don't have separation of power systems, but you sort of disperse. And then there's the question, of course, how to deal, because these parties would normally reach somewhere like 20% or something. I mean, of course, the question is for the remaining 80% of those who carry voters to decide how do we form stable, functioning majorities. How difficult that is, I would say it has to do with what issues are the most salient in politics. So if, for instance, it would seem that policymakers, politicians around in Europe would say, well, today, you know, this is the real concern, the issues that we are talking here about, then I would say the chances would be better for them to agree among themselves and to say, okay, this is what we have to prioritize. Yeah. So you have to, you know, and for traditional parties, I think there is a bit of a problem. It's as if we are pursuing politics without the future. And, you know, the populist challenge, it has a future. It's often backward looking, but it has a promise of something that will happen. Traditional parties would need to rethink a little bit, you know, what's the promise for what kind of future and why should we do this? Unless they find back to that, I think it's really hard to stand against this.
Mm-hmm. And Mikael's questions?
I think it was nothing that I can really, I think it's better for the other panelists.
Okay, Barbara?
Well, I mean, I don't have the answers on voters, but maybe just two thoughts on voters here. And I think, first of all, I think political systems are a difference. The other system that's worth studying, or the other difference that's worth studying is Europe, is that you have European countries with pro-Russian populist parties, and you have European countries with anti-Russian populist parties. And I think that might actually make a difference in the years down the line. And France and Germany are obviously in the camp with pro-Russian populist parties. Second quick point on voters. I mean, if I look at the German debate, what I sometimes wish is that the politicians, and to a certain extent also the expert community, sort of in the pro-supporting Ukraine camp, had a little bit more courage in dealing with this escalation issue. Because, I mean, this is a core issue in the German debate. There is a risk of escalation. We are scared. We don't want this. Let's make peace with Russia, right? I mean, that is a message that's there. And this has often been responded to in debates with that, no, there is no risk of escalation. And I think that was a massive mistake. The right answer would have been, yes, there is a risk of escalation because there is not a single war without a risk of escalation. But here's the list of reasons why we need to take this risk, because all the alternatives are worse. And that is something that I've rarely seen German politicians do, but where it's always been, no. If you think that there's a risk of escalation, you're buying into Putin's propaganda, so you're actually on the wrong side of history there. And I think, I'm not saying that this in itself explains everything, but I do think that this is a communication mistake that was made and that we should learn from in the future. Now, when it comes to how to prevent Russia and the United States from making a deal here, honestly, if I knew, I probably wouldn't sit here. I do not think we can. Now, if I understood your question correctly, you were also talking about a deal that is acceptable to Ukraine. And I think, I mean, this is also something that most European governments will happily hide behind. Say, well, we always said that it's for Ukraine to call this war off when they think that they are at a point where they want to accept an offer, and they will most likely.
I meant, if there is a deal, let's say next week, and it's unacceptable for both Ukraine and Europe, what should Europe do?
probably enter into some sort of GDR situation by not officially recognizing things. But I lack the imagination to see anything concrete Europe could be doing except maintaining sanctions against Russia and so on and so forth. But I mean, sort of doing something to actually change the situation on the ground, I wouldn't see what that is. Maybe you do.
I wish I had a simple answer to these conundrum that we face, but I think what we should at least recognise that Europe is not completely powerless in this situation. I mean, if you look at the IISS in London, the think tank, the IISS military balance indicated that Russia now spends more on defence than the European countries put together. And yet, you look at the Russian economy. I mean, I know Putin has sort of geared it up to be a war economy, but the Russian economy is about the size of that of Italy. European countries together have a GDP that's 12 times that of Russia. It should be in our capability to both invest in our defence and to provide for Ukraine, and take some responsibility for our own future. I mean, this is, I think, the sort of lesson that we'll have to learn and absorb that comes, that has sort of hit us in the face from the Munich events and now the sort of negotiations in Riyadh. That we have to take responsibility for our own continent. For our own future and our own continent, and we should not, underestimate the potential that we have. I mean, we've underinvested in defence capabilities. We took an awful long time to recognise the threat that was emerging in the east, that looming shadow of war. But hopefully this is a wake-up call for Europe. And I also remember thinking in terms of the future of the EU. Jean Monnet, in his memoirs, wrote something along the lines that the EU will be forged in crises and will be the result of its responses to those crises. And I think if we see a sort of Putin-Trump deal on Ukraine over the heads of the Ukrainians and the Europeans, then that will be a real incentive for Europeans to find perhaps both their backbone, but also unity, and to build unity. And I actually agree with Göran. At the end of the day, we have to do that within actually the main institutional pillars. And I think that's above all the EU, although NATO is still the primary sort of vehicle for defence, military integration and cooperation. And it needs to become more European. I'm not sure that's really answered the question, but
How about Björn's question?
On democracy and the unexpected.
Stable governments.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I think you're right to say that it's the unexpected that we have to think about. I can remember the British Conservative Prime Minister Eden was let's say it was Eden was asked at one stage, what's the biggest thing politicians should think about and be aware of? And he thought for a moment, and he said, events, old boy, events. And you're quite right, it's unexpected events that, will be the sort of trigger the crises and the problems that we will have to deal with in the future. Who would have seen, in a way, who would have seen Russia risking so much by invading Ukraine? Perhaps the indications were there, but, it was certainly a shock for most Europeans. So it's events, old boy, events that we have to think about and prepare for. Macmillan, thank you. Yeah.
We have only 10 minutes left, and I have sadly not the possibility to take in all. So the two who were first, Marianne Lanatza and then you. Yeah, but first Marianne. Sorry, Thomas.
Thank you very much. Very interesting discussion indeed. But I would like to broaden the perspective, because European Union has been so, of natural reason, focusing on Ukraine and the crisis, and not only for also within the European Union, but when European Union have had delegations all over, they wanted to make other people understanding in Africa that, you know, we have to give the resources to Ukraine. And that is the question that you have to, we want them also to give their support to Ukraine. We do it in the Arab Gulf states, we do it all over, we go to India and so on. I think that while both Russia and the US is working on a global ground and changing things, we have been so much focusing on Ukraine for natural reasons, and of course, we are that. But we have to look at global perspectives. And I have a suggestion. Now, when all this vaccination is stopped by the US, why couldn't the European Union say, we will pay it in Africa? That could create goodwill. And we need it in Africa for many reasons. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, please.
Two questions. Why is Zelensky's proposal to have EU armed forces dead? And is coalition of forces an embryo to scale up to EU armed forces?
Yep. Admirably short question, so I won't start with Göran again. I've done that too many times, so no, Adrian.
Oh. I mean, I really think that the idea of a European army, an EU army, this would involve an enormous diversion of resources and time and energy when we need to focus on building up the European pillar of NATO. I think, and above all, we need to just develop our capabilities and national capabilities, as well as collective capabilities. But to start, I don't know, trying to duplicate command posts and command structures and get EU countries to commit forces to be deployed under EU hat when they're struggling to find enough forces for NATO plans. I don't think that's where we should put our time and energy at the moment. I'm sorry.
And the UK as part of that force.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Marianne's, sorry, Adrian, Marianne Lanatza's.
Yeah. No, I mean, on the European army, sorry.
Sorry, should I answer the question on
Yeah,
vaccines?
you take both questions. Yeah, we have to do.
Yeah, I think that's a laudable aim and ambition. But I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's quite right that we look at the crisis in our backyard and the immediate threat to our security and our sovereignty and our territorial integrity and of that of our EU and NATO allies before we try to save the rest of the world, if I can put it that bluntly. Sorry.
Barbara. Both questions, please.
On the European army, I fully agree with what's been said, and I would add that I actually find it important under current circumstances to also not get distracted by this question, which is sort of very philosophical and hypothetical, and maybe in 100 years or so, when we have the United States of Europe, we can have the European army, but certainly not now. On this proposal, yes, of course, I think that is important, and I think this obviously goes way beyond the scope of the seminar here today, but I think as Europe, we actually do need to invest some time in how to think about how we want to interact with the rest of the world and how to position Europe in this world that is emerging, right, with China and Russia and the United States and the so-called global South accusing us of double standards and quite frankly, often rightly so. But I mean, this is sort of part of a longer reflection that I hope we will not completely lose sight of, because the key issues right now at hand are, of course, Russia and Ukraine and so on. But this is not everything, right? I mean, the world is much bigger than that. And I hope that we will have the calmness necessary in the years to come to also think about these issues.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for great questions again. I take them in reverse order, I thought. So, I mean, I tend to share the view on the idea or the discussion about the European army. However, there's also been, which I think you alluded to, it's this week's discussion about what would happen after the eventual some kind of agreement in relation to Ukraine and that individual countries could support. To my mind, it seems, and here I must say that, although he didn't express it perhaps in the best of ways, but I think Olaf Scholz had a point to say that, is this really what we should be talking about right now? Because, I mean, the main message has been from that meeting, should have been, to my mind, is that number one is that Ukraine is on board with whatever happens. Then what happens? Okay, we can talk about that, right? So I think it becomes a little bit, that's the narcissism of small differences that we sometimes happen in Europe. And we're a union of 27 plus UK, and of course, and it's a media logic that want to challenge. But I would like to raise one more element in relation to Ukraine that we touched upon in relation to enlargement of the EU. And that is, of course, that also, I mean, we not to overstate it, but I mean, in the European Union treaties, we have this Article 42.7. It is not backed by the same organization. It does not have the same quality in its content as Article 5, obviously, all of that. But the perspective of a Ukrainian EU membership without NATO membership, and the decision-making procedure, Article 42.7, is different from that of Article 5 in the NATO Treaty. The NATO Treaty, you have to agree, right? In Article 42.7, it's upon the member state who is under some sort of attack to raise the question. I'm just foreseeing a scenario where one member state, particularly Ukraine, could be under certain situations quite repeatedly. And that's the moment when all the other member states will need to think, what do we really mean by this? How do we really back it? And eventually, what does that functionally do to the European Union? I understand this is a bit further ahead, but it's worth thinking a little bit about at least. Now, finally, on Marianne's question, I mean, I think it's a very important one, because now Europeans are struck by the feeling that not even the alliance across the Atlantic, we are on agreement in Ukraine. But that's also the moment where we should think about we were quite on our own before that too. So the global south is not particularly interested in what happens in Ukraine. So for Europeans, of course, and I think the EU is trying to do that a little bit, it's a question of reaching out. Because also, the longer-term perspective is that we are a declining part of world population, world GDP. That means we need to find ways to reach out to the rest of the world. Do we have the time? Do we have the focus? Not sure, but I think in the long term, it's important. And just as Barbara said, I mean, it's a question also, how do we equip ourselves? Because, I mean, essentially, European Union is a soft power, equipped for a world more Kantian, let's say. And now if it's an Hobbesian world, how do we equip ourselves with the right tools to survive and to prosper and potentially to influence the rest of the world to become slightly more Kantian in the future, hopefully?
Thank you. Veronica, you had a point on this question, right? Or no?
I was actually the short comment and indirectly also Göran. Yeah, I'm not going to talk. I promise I'm not talking. Just to say to Mikael, because I did there, otherwise we often agree on most aspects, but your question earlier, which was my main comment when you said, what if there's a deal between Russia and the US next week? That's not a deal. That might be a bilateral agreement. We're talking about the Ukraine, and if it involves Europe, also Europe's involvement. If Ukraine is not on board, there is no deal. It has to be a deal accepted by the two parties, if you want to. So therefore, I thought just putting that comment or putting the question was for me a wrong question. Sorry.
Okay. So now comes the point to say a gigantic thank you for a wonderful session. And thank you to everyone here. for coming and for giving us very challenging and good questions. This day has more than fulfilled my expectations for the audience, for the speakers, and well, it was a great day for me, and I hope it was a great day for you as well. So thank you very much.